Uh, so this is Shulchan Aruch 62, praying in other languages with regard to the Shema. You can pray in another language. You can say the Shema in another language. So the Berahita writes, it has to be understand it in order to do the Amida or Shema or grace after meals, Mazan in another language. Kiddush because of Peros, making Kiddush and blessing on food and a blessing on a mitzvah and Hallel. If you're using a different language and you don't even understand the language, you fulfill your obligation. Very interesting, for Hallel and for blessings on and for blessings. Whereas Shema and Birkat Hamazon and Tefillah, the Birkat Hamazon, grace after meals, is different than blessings before food because it's biblical. It's Doraita. It's a commandment from the Torah. So maybe that's why you have to understand it. Whereas Hallel and blessings and commandments, blessings on food, are not from the Torah, they're rabbinic. Maybe that's why. He quotes it from Tosfos. Okay, then the Mishnah Berurah, you'll see it's very different. B'chol lashon, right? So what does the Mishnah Berurah do with this, right? He's faced with, the growing reform movement. We're already grown by the late 1800s, early 1900s. B'chol lashon, in any language, it says the dafka shemevin b'oto lashon. It's only if you understand that language. V'huadin b'tefillah b'chemag b'kiddush b'berchas mitzvos peros v'halel. So that's very different than the Berahita. Right? The Berahita had said, even if you don't understand it, for Kiddush and for blessings on food, it's okay. Mishnah Berurah doesn't. He lumps it all together. He says that prayer Birkat Hamazon is the same as Kiddush and brachas, is the same as brachas on food and Hallel. Chazeh mitzad din. And this is all just the law. Aval lemitzvah min hamufchar, to do it well, hudafka b'lashon hakodesh. It should be in Hebrew. That's interesting. In other words, let's say that that works okay because he holds that you have to understand the other language. So let's say you don't understand Hebrew and you do understand the other language, which is better? According to Mishnah Berurah, Hebrew would certainly be better. But I don't know if maybe that's the case. Ken Kazav Abach b'simin kuf tzadi gimel. Ba'im b'sifrei achronim to be menu. And look at what the Achronim, the recent commentaries, say, to be a menu that in our days, this is similar to what he said in Kuf Aleph. He says, in our days, we should be careful not to read it. It's true that you're allowed to read it in another language, but we should be careful not to. We should only do it in Hebrew. There are many letters and words that we don't know how to say them. What does it mean, vishinantam? You shall teach them to your children. So it could have a lot of different translations. It could mean studying it, teaching it. It could mean making it beloved in somebody else's eyes. It should be fluent in your mouth. That you shouldn't get mixed up about the words. That's what chidud means. That it should be from the word chad, sharp. It should be sharp in your mouth. It should be flowing. So we don't know exactly what's the translation of vishinantam. Does it mean to teach? Does it mean that it should be fluent? He's saying that we don't really know the translation clearly. Into another language, et, like the word et, which just signifies an object in the sentence. Telas the totafos. Padoma, we translate the totafos as frontlets between your eyes, but I don't know who came up with that translation because we don't really know what the word totafos means. Padoma, aval kisha'anu korin shma b'lashon hakodesh. When we read it in Hebrew, whether it's prayer or grace after meals, Kiddush, Shari Brachos, and other blessings. Even if you don't understand the language, you're Yotze, you fulfill your obligation. Because everybody, it's interesting his reason. It says, Ki ein anu mevin Yotze, Dezeh eino matzoi, Shebein Yisrael lo yada b'ra pasuk rishon shema, shakavana bo li'ikuva. That besides for the first line of the Shema, everything else you still fulfill your obligation, even if you don't know the translation. So he's trying hard to make a it'd be interesting to see where he gets this argument from, the argument that we don't know how to translate things. Who's it quoted from? Bach. Just as achronim. It'd be interesting to see who that is. In other words, because this idea doesn't seem to come up before. The idea that there's an assumption that we can translate things. You can do them in other languages. The translation is not perfect, but that doesn't matter. But the Mishnah Berurah feels that he's making an argument that you should do it in Hebrew if you don't understand it, right? And it's the argument the Reform we're making where people don't understand it. So he's saying if you don't understand it, it's better because translation is impossible, he's saying. This is the Kaf HaChaim. He's a Sephardi, but he lives in the 1900s. He says, Sham Yachal Ikrosa B'chalash. Is a Yachal Ikrosa B'chalash. You can read it in any language. V'zeu Mitzad Din. This is right, same language as the Chavetz Chaim. This is the law. Aval Fima Shalomar Simon Samach Aleph. Os Aleph, Os Beis, B'Shem Zohar Ba'ari. He resorts to kind of a mystical side. He says, sure, in halacha, you can do it in any language, but you're going to have a mystical problem if you do that. Diesh kavanos keneged aparshios mispar hatevos, because in Kabbalah, there's a concept that the prayers, right? For instance, the Shema, if you don't have a minyan and you're not going to repeat Hashem Elokechem Emet at the end of the Shema, what do? You say Kel Melech Ne'eman at the beginning. Why do we do that? We do that because we want to have exactly 248 words in the Shema, because it corresponds to certain the negative can be negative commandments and the positive, the negative commandments and the parts, the limbs of the body. So the number of words is very important on a Kabbalistic level. So so translating it is going to change that. Gam od kavanas hashaychim b'rashi tevos so and other there's other subtleties to the Hebrew language that are not going to translate that you can find in Shar HaKavana of the Arizal. You can only have that in Lashon HaKodesh. Very interesting. So he's making an argument that even if you don't understand it, you should do it in Hebrew. What's his argument? It's not the same as the Chavetz Chaim's that you can't really translate it correctly. What he's saying is you lose the Kabbalistic side of it. So that's interesting. So even though those things were not necessarily argued, you're saying you could derive that from the Arizal, which I'm sure is true. Among Hasidim, I'm very careful to not skip any part of the prayer service because there's a sense that the number of words and these mystical things are very, very important. So it depends where you're coming from. Is it better to know what you're talking about when you pray, or is it better to do it in Hebrew? Obviously, what I'm arguing is that part of what they're speaking to, more modern commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, like the Mishnah Berurah, it is not just the halacha, or even just the Kabbalah. I think it's also impacted by the era. Okay, so let's take a look at his argument here for doing in any language. So this is what we're looking at. The Magen Avraham. So he quotes Magen Avraham that we looked at. That, remember, the Magen Avraham, let's go back to that page, had said, that we looked at the other day, in any language, you pray in any language. A congregation could pray in any language, but an individual should only pray in Hebrew. And the Magen Avraham had said, Mutav lispalel kasav besefer hamitzvos, the mutav lispalel b'lashon shemevin, that it's better to pray in a language you understand if you don't understand Hebrew, right? That's a statement that is just the opposite of what the Mishnah Berurah says. And the Mishnah Berurah 300 years later says that's not true. It is better to pray in Hebrew, even if you don't understand it. Why? Because translation won't be good. The Kaf HaChaim, because you lose the mystical side. Right? Or the best mitzvah is in Hebrew. Did he argue against the, I wonder if he quoted them on them wrong? No. So they disagree. Okay. So that's what this book, the Cherev Nokemis Nekambris, is quoting. Right? Even in prayer, you should do it in a language you understand. This is the crux of one of the big arguments about opening the Hamburg Temple. And then the Shulchan Aruch says, Yochel is Paul b'chol lashon shir. So you can pray in any language you want. Is that an individual or a community? The answer is Hanemila b'tzibor. That's a community. Right, an individual should pray in Hebrew. But a community, I mean, that, in a certain sense, this piece of the Shulchan Aruch plays right into the hands of the Hamburg Temple. And so, of course, that's what he's quoting. So now he actually has a little star here about who he's arguing against in the book that this is a polemic against, and that is the book of the Hamburg Bezdin. Right? So he says, Ra'u zeh ra'a neged panehem. See that this is a quote from when the Jews come out of Egypt. See, this is wickedness against their face, against them. Mi chacham, in other words, I'm pointing out their wickedness. Mi chacham bishmar eleh. Who will be wise and guard these words? Now, this is a phrase in the Torah, but the word eleh is in bold. Why? Because it refers to eleh divrei habrit. These are the words of the covenant, the book of the Hamburg Bezdin. Sponenu darkeim, and understand their ways, the ways of the Bezdin. Ki mirma befihem, there is lies in their mouth. The v'lashonim yechazvu, and trickery in their language. Marim panim b'Torah, they are deciding the law shalok halacha, not like the law. This is an incredible. This is a very strong accusation. Megala panim, a person who on purpose decides a law and they know that that's not the law. I mean, the Talmud says very bad things about that. But Amram kinefochu, and they're saying it's the opposite. They're saying in the Hamburg Bezdin book that an individual doesn't understand Hebrew. Let them pray. Let them either learn Hebrew or maybe they can pray in English. But a congregation should never pray in the vernacular in German. They should only pray in Hebrew. But he says, what are you talking about? That's just the opposite of the Shulchan Aruch. So Boer A, and then he quotes several places in the book of the Hamburg Bezdin, Eleh Divrei Bris. Number one, Michtav Me'arav of Pressburg. Who's the rabbi of Pressburg? The Chassam Sofer, right? And that's Diba, which is Divrei Habrit, but also means Lashon Hara, Daf Yud, and also Daf Lamed Ches. So let's see Daf Yud. The letter of the Chassam Sofer. Here's the letter of the Chassam Sofer. Okay. May Rabbi Gonim before some Shvach of Moshe Sofer of Pressburg. Okay, this is Zion. Let's look at his whole letter. He says, that prayers come from the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, from the men of the Great Assembly. They're very old. And he says they want to take away references to the Messiah, and they want to pray in German, referring to the new temple. And that's what I saw in the letter that you wrote to me. Right, he's responding to the letter of the Hamburg Bezdin that solicited the letter from him. Is this true? Ma'ashiv, what should I answer? So he says, V'lachol pachos and elef shegam kodem hayos ba'oz tzara v'gzer hamispal b'chol yom mishum kach lo aveti raya miderech hamelech. Okay. Avol Daniel mispal shlosh pamim b'chol yom umaster nafsho al zeh shehushlach legover rayos. He's saying that Daniel prayed every day, 3 times a day, and this Hamburg temple is not praying 3 times a day, and Daniel was thrown into the lion's den for it. So he says, number one, they're not praying 3 times a day. So that's part of his argument against reform to begin with, that they're leaving out Musaf. We saw that before, and then he says. He says you can't change what we've been doing from an earlier. One Beit Din cannot change an earlier Beit Din's ruling unless they're greater than them in wisdom. And so he says, how can the reform do that? How can the reform change what we've been doing? They're not greater. And so he takes them pretty seriously. Says v'im ledin halo ein bezdin yachol about the divrei habezdin chavera lim can go to men of chachamini. You can only change what a beit din did. A current beit din can only change the words of a previous beit din if they're bigger and wiser. V'lebatal atam lebatal atakana. And even if the reason is gone, the decree is not gone. And and especially when it comes to prayer, which has spread out among the whole Jewish people. And it's true that there's different nuschaot, there's different ways of different versions. But the idea of Hebrew prayer is everywhere. It's true that so he says, but Ashkenazim have one way and Sephardim have another way. It's not that everybody makes their own version. So you want to go and make your own version of prayer. He says that's not permitted. We'll see when we get to Daf Yud. He first talks a little bit about the organ, and then he talks about prayer in the vernacular. And so we'll read that. And of course, you can be sure he doesn't like it. But what's he going to do, right? The question we want to keep our eye on is, how does the Chassam Sofer respond? How would the Chassam Sofer respond? I mean, isn't he kind of trapped by the Shulchan Aruch? Shulchan Aruch does that. He can pray in another language, and even a congregation can. Even more so, a congregation can. So we'll see some more of that. Okay, have a good day.
Thank you.